Each of the data regions based on the Tablix include pre-configured properties that govern the behavior of rows, columns, and groups for the specific type of data region. But you can modify those as you want to blend characteristics of each type. The default settings are going to be appropriate for most uses of each data region, but you're by no means limited to those defaults. And if you later decide that you need a data region to morph into one of the other types, you can easily change its properties to accomplish that, as well as go beyond the default behaviors. Not only is the Tablix powerful and flexible, but it really is a chameleon. Or maybe a better analogy would be the Transformers animated characters. When you drag one of these regions to a report's design surface and right-click on the region to set its properties, you won't find any mention of the table, matrix, or list. As of the version of reporting services that shipped with SQL Server 2008, Microsoft merged the table, matrix, and list data regions into a single unified data region, which is the Tablix. But to make the transition easier, Microsoft still lists the older data regions in the toolbox. Think of the table, matrix, and list items on the toolbox as three different starter views or orientations of the Tablix data region. Now the name Tablix is a derived smashed together word from table, list, and matrix. And I'm putting them there in order that makes the name's origin a little bit clearer. Something that's interesting about using a single Tablix component to support both table and matrix data regions is that you have enormous flexibility in how you can combine features from both. For example, you can use a Tablix to combine the static columns of a table with the dynamic columns of a matrix, using both to display data in the report. To create such a hybrid data region, you could start with a table and modify it to include dynamic repeating columns. Or you could start with a matrix and add static columns that remain fixed no matter what happens with the underlying data. The best part is that you can start with either type of component from the Report Designer toolbox and modify it to have the characteristics of the other component. In order to make effective use of a Tablix, it's important that you understand each component's distinguishing features, particularly before you start trying to blend together the characteristics of a table, matrix, and list within a single report. With that understanding, particularly in regards how they handle rows and columns, groups, and properties, will help you design and create some very flexible report designs. All right, so let's start talking about the table data region. A tabular report is based on a table data region, and that's the kind of report that most people visualize when they hear the word report. A tabular report consists of columns of data that correspond to database fields and rows of data that correspond to database records. Putting it another way, a table consists of fixed columns and dynamic rows, so that the number of columns stays the same while the number of rows changes depending on the number of records in the underlying data set. So the end result is that if you have a data set that has 10 records in it, you might end up with a single page report. But if you have thousands of records, maybe the report's going to be 50 pages. So the columns stay constant, but the rows dynamically change based on the information within the data set. All right, so all of this reflects the dynamic nature of data in a database table, as rows are added and removed, and values change that affect the number of rows that pass a filter. All right, so here I have SQL Server Data Tools open. I'm going to come over here to the toolbox and drag a table over to the designer surface. All right, so that's the appearance of a table when you first add that kind of data region to a report design surface from the toolbox. So you start with this 3-column, 2-row layout. The number of columns starts out fixed as 3, but you can add and remove as many columns as you want. The first row is a static header row, and the second row is a dynamic detail row that will display however many rows of data the report contains. You can tell the second row is a detail row when I select that row because of that detail icon right there, the 3 horizontal lines. It's also a group because of its repeating nature, once for each row of data, And this orange bracket right there indicates that this single row comprises an entire group. And as we look at different reports, you'll see how groups can overlap multiple rows. All right, now you can add additional header and detail rows to the data region, as well as add and remove static columns to fit the needs of your report. So if I right-click on a header row and select Insert Row, you can see that I can insert a new row above or below the selected row. So I'll go ahead and insert one above that, and now you can see that we have two header rows. Now, things are a little bit more complicated when you insert a details row, because not only can you insert the new row above or below the selected row, you can put it inside or outside of the group. So I'll right-click here, Insert Row, and now I have some additional options. And as you can see, I can put it inside the group or outside the group. Now, outside a group essentially makes it a header or footer row for that group of records in the report. With multiple details rows, each set of detail rows appears on the report for each record in the data set. So that's an important thing to understand, because this is a great way to display a lot of information within the limited width of report. So each customer record, for example, can occupy, say, 3 rows within the report. And then there's various visual things that you can do in order to help the user easily identify that each customer takes up 3 rows. Now, when you add a new header or detail row, the new row takes on some of the characteristics of the existing row, such as the font that you have set for the row that you select, as well as the background color. But numeric formatting is not inherited, so you'll need to apply those settings to the columns in the new row if those settings apply to that new row. Now what I'm going to do is open up an existing report and show you a few more features. So I'll open up Table Demo there. Double click on it, and it opens up within the Report Designer. Now this is a table layout that demonstrates several table features, and more specifically, the features of a Tablix when it's configured as a table. Now the report uses a data set that consists of sales data from the AdventureWorks DW 2012 database, and it's grouped by sales territory and year. So if we go over here to the report data and look at data sets, the name of the data set is Sales by Territory Year data set. I can right click on that and look at the data set properties, and you'll see that it's linked to a shared data set, Sales by Territory Year. And we can open up that right there, and there you can see the query that I used in order to generate this data set. Okay, nothing all that particularly interesting about that query, but it shows where it's coming from that AdventureWorks data warehouse. So the table has 2 header rows, which I've made easier to identify by making the background color a kind of a light blue. And then the data for each of the records within the data set is spread over 2 rows. So these are the detail rows. And in fact, if I select a cell, you can see that I have 2 detail rows and a single group, that yellow bracket. And then there are also 2 footer rows, which I added by right-clicking on the detail row and selecting row and putting it outside the group below. Now notice that I can't select outside the group above, because immediately before this row that I right-clicked on, there's a detail row, and so I can't put a row from outside the group between those 2 detail rows. So the options that you have available within this pop-up menu are going to depend upon where you right-clicked. Okay, so if I select different rows, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to actually select it as opposed to the text inside. So I have a cell selected here, and you can see that there are visual clues provided by the table layout when I've selected those rows, depending on whether it's a header row or footer row or a detail row. Okay, so once again, detail rows have this icon on the left, so that makes it easy to identify those rows from the others. Header and footer rows have no such icons. There are the footers. And then this left square bracket that spans the detail rows shows that there's a single group defined for this table, which happens to be on each individual record within the data set. And then more complex table layouts can have more details, but these are the basics. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this report. This is the first time I'm doing it since I opened up Data Tools in Visual Studio, so it takes a few seconds for it to display the preview screen and then go out and read the data from the database. So that's to spool up the database, execute the query, and then finally generate the report. Okay, so each record in the underlying data set contains data for each territory and year combination. So you can see that I have Europe in 2006, Europe in 2007, Europe in 2008. So apparently there were no Europe sales in Europe in 2005, but there were in North America, so there's 4 years of data for North America. And then the Pacific region had just 2 years of data. And then each record in the data set spans 2 rows within the final report. And then finally, the footer down here contains the sum of the sales tax, tax amount, quantity, and average sale for each detail row. And again, if I go up to the top, you can see that I have headers that identify that this value is the sales amount, this value is the quantity. And there's a variety of ways that you can use in order to identify what's what within a particular table. And this is just one way. Okay, I also want to let you know that all of the queries that I used in the videos where I discussed the Tablix are contained within the chapter sample files. So they're just regular .sql files. And so I created these script files in order to create the queries, and then I copied them into the report designer when I created the shared data sources and the data sets that I would use within the report. Okay, so you can play with those files, makes it easier to see and understand what each query is doing, and then you can execute each to examine the data that's returned by each. So you have sort of a raw view into the data as opposed to the pretty view that's displayed by the report. Okay, so there's a pretty good chance the table is going to work for most of your report building needs. It's probably the first component that you want to turn to. And the reason is because it displays tabular data so effectively. And then there are plenty of options if you need more flexibility. But if you need both rows and columns to be dynamic, not just rows, then you're probably going to need to use the Tablix as a matrix data region. A matrix is Reporting Services term for what other programs sometimes call a crosstab or a pivot table. A report based on a matrix is useful for aggregating data into a format that's more readily visualized than a plain table format. A matrix report lets you display an aggregate statistic such as the count of items sold by 2 fields such as salesperson and month. A matrix consists of both dynamic columns and rows, so the number of each could change each time you run the report as the underlying data changes. All right, I'll go ahead and add a matrix to this blank report and position it up there. And there you have the initial view of the matrix. It's this 2-column, 2-row layout. The matrix is quite a bit more flexible than a table, letting both rows and columns be dynamic based on the data set associated with the data region. And you can add static rows and columns as well. Now, when I select a detailed data cell, the matrix includes the square bracket both to the left of the row and to the top of the column. So this is what's new with the matrix. So these give a visual indicator of how data is going to be grouped when you execute the report. The major difference between the initial table and matrix layouts is that there's no detail area by default in the matrix. Instead, the selected data cell requires the use of an aggregate function, such as sum or average. So by default, a matrix is an aggregated view of data, whereas a table is more appropriate for primarily showing the details. But remember, these are both Tablix components, so you can blend the features of the 2 data regions. So now let me open up another sample here called Matrix Demo, which is an already completed report that I have. So this shows a few of the options that you have for customizing the rows and columns for a matrix data region. So there are two cells that contain the detailed data. And these contain the sales amount and the order quantity fields within the data set. But as you can see, they're not the raw data from a single row in the table, but they're aggregated, in this case by sum. So each of these items is grouped and summed by product category and the year of the order. Okay, so the resulting matrix, when you execute the report, is going to have a pair of rows, sales and quantity, as you can see by these left column or row headers, for each unique product category in the data set, and one column for each year. As a result, the number of rows and columns is dependent on the data in the data set rather than being fixed at design time. Now the layout also includes both row and column totals for each year and each sales and quantity value for each category. These aren't an automatic part of a matrix. You have to add them by right-clicking the data cell and selecting Add Total from the pop-up menu. So if I select that and right-click there, you can see that we have Add Total, and you can do it either for the row or the column. I'm not going to select it here because I've already added both the row and column totals for this report. And then finally, the layout includes several static labels. The sales and category labels here within the row group are repeated for each product category. And the header and footer labels appear just once in the report. So these are just going to appear once, and these are going to appear once. Now, I could have also added the sales and quantity labels to the row header, as I did with the earlier table layout that I showed you. So you have options in how you label information. And then, to make the report more attractive, I've added some background color to the row and column headers, as well as bolding the totals. All right, so I'll go ahead and run that report. First time I've run it, takes a few seconds. Database engine is already spooled up, but it has to go in and extract the data. So if you were to look at the underlying data, you'd find that orders span the years 2005 to 2008. So I have dynamic columns for each of the years that span the data within the database, or within the data set that I extract for this report. And then there are 4 product categories: accessories, bikes, clothing, and components. And so the report matrix actually expands to accommodate the data because there's 4 different categories. If there are fewer categories, there'd be fewer sections. If there were more categories, there'd be more rows. So the matrix has expanded to display every combination of those 2 aggregations of data, the category and the year. Now, one of the questions that you're going to encounter is where to do the grouping. A matrix data region needs to group the data in order to function correctly, in order to show this kind of dynamic row and dynamic column kind of behavior. Now, you can pre-group the data that you feed to a matrix, but it's not absolutely necessary. If you pass detailed data to a matrix data region, you'll have to design the report a little bit differently, but it'll group the data when creating the column groups. That said, most of the time, most users find it natural to pre-group the data using SQL's group by clause within the query. And for larger data sets, pre-grouping the data before it's sent to reporting services will almost always result in more efficient reports, which means faster reports. But you can allow the reporting services and the matrix data region to do that grouping for you. It'll just take a little bit longer to render the report, or a lot longer depending upon the underlying data. So all of the examples that I'm going to show you with the Tablix pre-group the data using the group by clause within the report's data set query. All right, and so in fact, can go over here, can look at the report data, see that it uses the sales by year category subcategory. I have that defined as a shared data set. So here's the sales by year category subcategory. I'll open that up. You can see it comes from several different tables, and then it has this group by clause in order to pre-group the data by year and category name. It also groups it by subcategory, but this report doesn't take advantage of that level of grouping. Okay, so that's how the data came. Now, keep in mind that you're not limited to using either a single row or column group in a matrix, as I did with this particular example. You can have multiple row, multiple column groups, and include group totals for the nested groups or just for the overall outer group. You have lots of flexibility in how you create these kind of reports. Table data regions display repeating rows of data in a spreadsheet-like format, with one row on the report more or less corresponding to one row from the data region's data set. List data regions, in contrast, display data in a less compact fashion. If you're familiar with developing ASP.NET Web Forms pages, a table data region is similar to using a grid view control, whereas a list data region is more analogous to a form view control. Don't worry if you're not familiar with those. All right, creating a list report isn't that different from creating a tabular report. One of the best ways to use a list is to group a collection of report items, such as text boxes or tables and charts. Each group of items appears once for each record in the underlying data set. All right, here's my blank report again. I'll go into the toolbox and this time add a list. So as you can see, the initial layout for a new list that you add to a report has a single group that contains only a rectangle. In this initial layout configuration, because it's a details group, you can only use a text box, data bar, or indicator non-repeating data regions inside the list. With a group list, though, you have more options for what you can include within the list itself. Adding a new row or column to the list is a bit tricky because the list initially contains a rectangle, and that's a container control. If you right-click here within the container area and select Insert, the options that appear here are for adding other controls within the rectangle, because a rectangle, again, is a container for other controls. So I can add text boxes, lines, tables, matrices, other lists, and so forth. But these are components as opposed to giving you the option for inserting new rows. All right, so instead what you need to do is right-click on a row or column handle. And again, that's the gray area to the left of a row or above a column. All right, so here, because I right-clicked in the handle area of the row, I have the Insert Row option, and I once again have the options to insert the new row inside the group, above or below, or outside the group, above or below. So keep in mind that that's the easy way of telling whether or not you right-clicked in the right place. If you get the option to insert rows or columns, if you click on the column handle, then you've clicked in the right place. But if you get the options for adding other lists and lines and text boxes and so forth, you've right-clicked within the details area, actually within a rectangle. Now what's kind of interesting here is if you do add a new row or a column within the details group, so I'll go ahead and insert a row inside the group and below, this item here is not a rectangle, but in fact is a text box. And you can see that if I go over here to the properties, and you can see that it's a text box. Whereas if I select that item there, it's a rectangle. Okay, so you're actually getting different objects here within the list than you initially get. You only by default get the rectangle in the new list that you add to the report. Okay, so from here you certainly could add a rectangle. That's one of the objects that you can add, but it just isn't there automatically. So that can be a little bit confusing when the behavior of a rectangle is different from that of a text box, even though it's not immediately obvious which a cell contains. Particularly if I select out here, I can't tell if that's a rectangle or a text box. Okay, so now I'm once again going to go over to a report that I've already created with the list. There you go. All right, so this is an example of a layout for using a list data region to create a free-form report that displays sales and other data by territory and year. The original detail area is this area right here. And it contains 3 text boxes in order to display that record's year, sales amount, and the order quantity. Now the quantity is an expression because I wanted to prepend the literal string quantity to the quantity amount. So if I right-click on that and go to expression, you can see that it's not just the order quantity, but I'm prepending this string to it. So I needed to use an expression for that. And then I also format the number as well in order to include comma separators between thousands. So again, these text boxes I added to the initial rectangle that it was part of the list when I first dragged it to this report. All right, now the layout also includes additional rows and columns, both within and outside of the details group. This red rectangle here is a data bar. It's a type of chart that the report uses to visually display the relative sales for each territory and year. Okay, so I added a column in addition to the initial rectangle here in order to have room for that data bar. Okay, and then the detail rows with this kind of pale turquoise background. These are additional fields from the detail row. The data region contains a total of 7 detailed rows, as you can see by the details icon on the left. And they're all contained within a single group because you can see that this bracket here encompasses all 7 of those rows. You can have different groups within the report, but in this case it's just a single row group. All right, then the data region also has a header and a footer. This header here is just a single row that has static text as a way of identifying this part of the report. And the 2 cells in the row I've merged into a single cell. So you can do that. It's just like merging cells within an Excel spreadsheet. And then the footer here contains 2 rows and includes this summation information. And this applies to all of the records that are displayed in the report. Okay, I'll go ahead and preview that. And here you can see the data. So it has the area, the year. So this is all for an individual row. Here's some additional information from that individual row. This is the relative sales. This is going to be relative across all of the rows here. So this had 5 million in sales. This only had 1 million, so this bar is a little bit wider. And you can do different kinds of data bars here, vertical and horizontal. The important data is that as it grows horizontally, that indicates greater sales. All right, I can continue to go down here. It's grouped by country and year. Go to a second page there and get down to the bottom, and there you can see the total sales and the total quantity. And everything is nicely formatted with currency and column separators. All right, so you can certainly get carried away with all the items that you can add to a list to build a report just about any way that you like.